It was a quiet afternoon in a small, tight-knit community where everyone thought they knew one another. Samuel, a retired veteran in his 70s, lived alone in a modest house on the outskirts of town. Known for his resilience and quiet demeanor, Samuel rarely spoke about his past, but the pride he carried in his posture spoke volumes about the battles he had fought and the life he had lived. To the younger generation in the area, however, he was just an old man, often seen tending to his garden or walking with his cane. What they didn't know about Samuel would soon change their perception forever. A gang of local troublemakers had been stirring unrest in the neighborhood. Their bravado and reckless behavior often went unchecked, and Samuel, a man of principles, had crossed paths with them before when he firmly but politely asked them to stop littering near his home. They didn't take kindly to being corrected and marked him as an easy target, assuming his age made him weak and defenseless. One fateful evening, when Samuel was returning home from the local store, the group decided to confront him, mocking his age and taunting him as if his years of wisdom was something to ridicule. What started as verbal harassment quickly escalated. The thugs thought they had all the power, laughing at his calm demeanor and ignoring the quiet fire in his eyes. But Samuel didn't react as they expected. There was no panic, no fear, just a steady gaze that seemed to see straight through them. Little did they know, Samuel's years of service had equipped him with not just physical strength, but an unshakable mind and resourcefulness. What unfolded next would leave the group stunned and the entire neighborhood talking for weeks. Samuel returned home that evening, his heart heavy but his mind steady. He wasn't someone who had ever sought conflict, yet trouble seemed to have found him. As he set his grocery bag down on the kitchen counter, he thought about the group of young men who had harassed him. Their laughter echoed in his mind, but he brushed it off like he always did. He faced much worse in his lifetime. However, this time something felt different, like a storm was brewing, and this was only the beginning. The gang of troublemakers, led by a brash young man named Jake, had a reputation in the neighborhood. They weren't hardened criminals, but acted like they owned the streets, taking advantage of the quiet town's lack of strict law enforcement. To them, Samuel represented something they didn't understand: discipline, strength, and the kind of quiet authority that comes from surviving life's hardest battles. Jake had grown up without guidance, and his bravado masked a deep insecurity. For him, picking on Samuel was a way to assert control, to feel powerful. He convinced the rest of the group that targeting Samuel again would be fun, harmless, and a way to prove their dominance. What Jake and his crew didn't know was that Samuel had a past that could silence even the loudest bullies. He wasn't just a veteran. He was a man who had served in the most challenging conditions, with stories of survival and heroism that few could even imagine. His quiet demeanor wasn't weakness, it was wisdom. Samuel's life had taught him that battles aren't always fought with fists, but with strategy, resilience, and timing. As the gang plotted their next move, Samuel prepared in his own way, sensing the brewing conflict and knowing he couldn't back down this time. The next day, Samuel sat on his porch, polishing an old rifle he hadn't touched in years. The weapon wasn't loaded, nor did he intend to use it for anything other than a reminder, to himself and anyone watching, that he was far from defenseless. Across the street, Jake and his group lounged by the corner store, their voices loud enough to carry over the quiet neighborhood. They saw Samuel on his porch and laughed among themselves, their sneering glances making their intentions clear. But Samuel didn't react. He stayed calm, his steady hands moving methodically over the rifle, the faint glint of metal catching the sunlight. Jake's second-in-command, a young man named Tyler, wasn't as sure about their plans. Tyler had been roped into the group for protection, not because he shared Jake's reckless sense of power. He had grown up listening to stories about Samuel from his grandfather, who often spoke of the older man's bravery during his service. "That's not a man you want to mess with," Tyler's grandfather had warned once. But Jake's influence was strong, and Tyler didn't want to be seen as weak. He kept his doubts to himself, though they gnawed at him with every passing hour. The gang watched in stunned silence as Samuel recounted his past, a decorated veteran who had served in some of the most dangerous conflicts, someone who had fought for freedoms they took for granted. "You thought I was weak because of my age," he said, his voice steady. "But you're about to learn just how wrong you were." Before they could respond, the headlights of additional vehicles appeared, raising the tension even further. This wasn't over, not yet. The tension was palpable as more vehicles pulled up, this time a mix of neighborhood residents and local authorities, all drawn by the commotion. Samuel stood firm, his military comrades by his side, while the gang stood frozen, unsure of their next move. One officer approached Samuel, nodding in respect. "We've heard enough from the neighbors to know what's been going on here. Seems like these boys have some explaining to do," he said, his gaze fixed on the gang. Jake, still trying to salvage the situation, attempted to speak, but Samuel raised a hand to silence him. "You've caused harm, disrespected my home, and underestimated me. But I'm not like you." "I don't believe in stooping to your level," Samuel said, his voice carrying an unexpected calmness. Turning to the officer, he added, "Let the law handle this." As the gang was rounded up, Jake's anger boiled over. "You think you've won, old man? You're still nothing but a relic," he shouted, but his words only revealed his desperation. Samuel's reply was steady and piercing. "If being a relic means standing for honor and courage, then I'll take it. But you, what will you stand for when this is over?" Just as the authorities began to take the gang away, the final twist unraveled. One of Samuel's comrades, a quiet man who had stayed back, approached Jake. "I know you," he said, his voice low but firm. "You're the one who ran from trouble before, changed your name, thought no one would remember. But I do." Jake's face turned pale as his secret past was exposed, a history of running from accountability, even years ago. Samuel watched as Jake's bravado crumbled completely. "Truth always comes out," he said simply. And with that, the gang was taken away, leaving the street in a hushed silence. Samuel, surrounded by his community and comrades, turned and walked back to his home, knowing justice had finally been served. As the dust settled and the flashing lights of police cars faded, the neighborhood began to feel a sense of calm again. Samuel stood on his porch, looking out at the quiet street where moments ago chaos had reigned. His friends from the military stayed a little longer, sharing stories and laughter that brought lightness back to the evening. They'd come prepared to stand by him, and they left knowing they'd helped protect more than just a home. They'd defended a legacy. In the days that followed, the community came together like never before. Neighbors who had once only exchanged polite ways now worked side by side, fixing the damage the gang had caused. Families brought food, supplies, and kind words, and Samuel's porch became a gathering place for heartfelt conversations. It was clear that the ordeal had strengthened bonds and sparked unity. Jake and his crew faced the consequences of their actions. Their arrest not only brought relief, but also exposed their long history of intimidation and misdeeds. For once, they were held accountable, and the neighborhood felt safer knowing justice had been served. Samuel's quiet strength became an inspiration to many. Parents told their children about his courage and the values he stood for. A local journalist even wrote a piece on the veteran's unwavering resilience, reminding readers that respect and integrity could conquer even the darkest moments. As Samuel sat on his porch one evening, he watched children playing on the street and neighbors sharing smiles. Despite the hardships, the veteran felt a deep sense of peace. The neighborhood had found its voice, and so had he. Sometimes, he thought, you don't have to fight alone. People will show up when it matters most. And with that, he leaned back, finally able to enjoy the home he had fought so hard to protect. That evening, the group decided to step things up. They lingered outside Samuel's property, yelling taunts and throwing small rocks at his fence. Samuel remained silent inside, watching their movements through the window. It wasn't fear that kept him from confronting them, it was patience. He knew the importance of timing, and had learned long ago that the best defense often comes from understanding your opponent. While the gang saw an old man they believed they could intimidate, Samuel saw an opportunity to teach them a lesson they'd never forget. As night fell, the group grew bolder, their shouts echoing through the quiet neighborhood. Jake, emboldened by the growing darkness, strutted up to Samuel's fence, banging on it with a stick and shouting insults. The others followed, laughing and egging him on. Inside, Samuel remained calm. He moved through his house with a quiet confidence, turning off lights and closing blinds, ensuring the thugs couldn't see what he was doing. The air was thick with tension, and even the neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. Tyler hesitated at the edge of the yard, his nerves beginning to fray. "Jake, maybe we should stop. What if someone calls the cops?" he muttered, but Jake waved him off with a laugh. "Cops don't care about him," Jake sneered. "He's just an old man. What's he gonna do?" His arrogance seemed to fuel the others, who began kicking at the fence and throwing bottles onto Samuel's lawn. The sound of glass shattering was like a trigger, heightening the tension to a breaking point. Inside, Samuel picked up his phone and made a call, his voice steady but firm. When he hung up, he walked to his front door, turned on the porch light, and stepped outside. His silhouette was commanding, his rifle slung casually over one shoulder. The group froze for a moment, their laughter dying in their throats. Samuel's presence alone was enough to make most of them uneasy, but Jake refused to back down. "What? You think you're gonna scare us with that old thing?" he taunted, his voice louder than his confidence. Samuel didn't reply. He simply stood there, his gaze steady, as if daring them to make the next move. The tension was unbearable, a silent standoff between experience and youthful recklessness. The quiet night was broken only by the distant sound of sirens, growing louder with every second. The gang exchanged nervous glances, realizing too late that the old man they underestimated had been steps ahead of them all along. As the sirens drew closer, the group began to scatter, but Jake held his ground, refusing to show weakness. "We're not scared of you," he shouted, though his voice cracked slightly. Samuel didn't flinch. Instead, he lowered the rifle to his side, his calm demeanor somehow more intimidating than any show of aggression. Just as the gang started to retreat, a pair of headlights appeared at the end of the street. The sound of the approaching vehicle wasn't a police cruiser, but something heavier, louder, a military truck. The truck rolled to a stop in front of Samuel's house, and several uniformed men stepped out, their presence commanding and disciplined. It wasn't the local authorities who Samuel had called, it was his old military comrades. The gang froze, their bravado dissolving as these strangers, clearly trained and experienced, stepped into the yard. "You all right, Sam?" one of them asked, his voice calm but firm. Samuel nodded, gesturing toward the now trembling group of thugs. "Looks like these boys need a lesson in respect," he replied coolly. Jake's confidence evaporated as he realized this wasn't the outcome he had expected. "We didn't mean anything by it," he stammered, trying to backtrack. But the men weren't interested in excuses. They weren't violent, but their presence alone was enough to make the gang's knees buckle. Samuel, however, wasn't done. "Before you run off," he said, stepping forward, "let me tell you something about who I am."